Hi, I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Liz.
We are two girls who married brothers and ended up with the exact same name. Together, we own Simple Simon & Company, a website where we love to share free quilting, sewing, and homemaking tutorials.
We're also the authors of the Simple Simon Guide to Patchwork Quilting. Today we're excited to teach you the Quilting Basics half-square triangle blocks, pillows, and quilt class. Let's get started with the materials.
Let's talk about them. Today in our course, we're going to be going through all the steps of quilting. So we really have meant this course to be a beginning to end course. So we're going to start with materials and we're going to finish up with finishing your quilt, binding it. You will have a completed quilt after this course.
If you've never made a quilt before, this is the class for you.
So let's talk about some basic quilting tools and things that we use. Most of these you probably will have. If not, don't panic. Most of them are relatively inexpensive, but they're great for quilting and they work really well.
Sometimes when you start something new, there's all these tools and gadgets that everyone says that you need to have. Some of them are really great, but for the majority of what you need for quilting, there's only these few basic tools that we have here to show you. So don't get caught up in all of the gadgets and the tools that there are available.
So the very first thing is a cutting mat. When you are in quilting, we really need to have accurate cutting. And so using a cutting mat, we like the ones with rulers on them. There are some that don't have rulers, but this is kind of our favorite. It's a big cutting mat that you can use. And then along with that cutting mat, you will also need what's called a quilting ruler that is right here. Again, I kind of like a big one, but they come in all different sizes. There's skinnier ones, there's longer ones, there's square ones. It kind of is your preference on that one. And then the third thing would be a rotary cutter. So those three things kind of go together, our mat, our quilting ruler, and our rotary cutter.
And you can see from the way that they're laid out here on the table that these rulers and the mat actually work together with the ruler grids on them, so you can check and double check as you are making your accurate cuts. That's my favorite thing about the ruler and the mats working together.
They do. They all work together. A couple other things that are probably necessities, and then we'll talk about a few more things that we love but typically aren't necessities. Scissors, you will want some good fabric scissors. Don't let your children take your fabric scissors. Anytime I see my children cutting paper, I'm like, wait, you have paper scissors, right? Not fabric scissors. So get a good pair of scissors just for cutting fabric because paper will dull them.
And with quilting, most of your cutting will be done by your rotary cutter, but you're still going to need some scissors, and we'll show you where they come into play in a little bit.
A few other things. A seam ripper is always a handy tool. I don't think there's a quilt I've made that I have not used a seam ripper. The more I sew, the more I seam rip, and it makes you a better sewist. So use that seam ripper, get one. There's lots of different kinds. There's ergonomical ones, there's plain ones. You pick your favorite seam ripper.
All you need something is to undo your mistakes because you're going to make them. All right, the next thing you need is pretty obvious. You're going to need a good thread. We usually use just white thread for most of our quilting, but our mothers would kill us if they heard us say that because they always match their thread to the fabric they use when they quilt. So that's a personal preference. We just use white. Today as we sew, we'll be using red just so you can see our stitching better.
Along with that, this isn't a necessity, but sometimes you will need to measure a quilt top. So a tape measure is also a great tool, especially if you're measuring how big it is at the very end, a very useful tool. One tool that we're going to talk about later in the course, but we'll introduce it here, is a walking foot. Sometimes your sewing machine will come with a walking foot. Sometimes it will be an additional purchase. They're not very expensive, but they are great for doing the actual quilting that we'll talk about in lesson 3.
All right, something that we'll talk about later in lesson 2 is a cutting glove, and that is actually something that you wear as you cut your fabric with to keep your hands from getting nicked, which is something I have done more than once, which is why I love to have the safety cutting glove.
A few other things. So we have some fabric marking pens. We love this brand, and we will show you why. They're kind of the magic pens because they erase with heat. So you don't need to worry if you're marking fabric with them because if you apply some heat to them, They will come right out
just
of your
disappear.
fabric. Make sure to try it. They've come out of every fabric I've used, but try it first. Don't quote me on that one. And then, let's see, what haven't we gone over? Oh, Wonder Clips. So these are called Wonder Clips. We'll kind of talk about these in lesson 3. I'm just going to open the box and show these to you. Whoops. I opened it upside down, but that's okay. You can kind of see right here, they look like little tiny
Like binder clips.
binder clips. And they are meant for holding the quilt binding on, and we'll show you exactly what those are used for. You can use them this way, or on the back side, they have a few lines to measure. I prefer to use them that way and hold my binding on my quilt. Not a necessity tool to begin with, but they're kind of a luxury that I love.
They really are, and they're an affordable luxury as well. And speaking of binding, you also will need some needles, and that is going to be when we show you how to hand bind your quilt, you're going to need needles. They'll come in handy.
We are going to need some fabric. We have some different fabrics right here. We'll talk about fabric choices as we go on in our lessons of great tips and tricks to use different fabrics in different quilts. And then our very last thing is our trimming ruler. Again, it's not a necessity tool, but it's a time saver. So sometimes we buy extra things that are time savers.
And this one we will show you how to use. It's little and it's square, and you can see that it's got some diagonal lines here. And we will show you what those are all about coming up in our next lesson.
And this one is specific just to half square triangles. But this one is a great ruler. It saves a lot of time in trimming up your units and your quilt blocks, and we love it.
All right, so that's all of our materials that we're going to need for today. We'll let you guys gather those up, and then we'll get started showing you how to make a half square triangle unit.
Before we move on to today's project, let's talk a little bit about what a half square triangle unit is and why they are so commonly used in quilting.
A half square triangle unit is exactly what it sounds like. So you've got a square of fabric that has been cut in half, and it makes 2 triangles. So it's a half square triangle. So that's easy to remember. The next thing is, it's not a quilt block. It's just a unit that is used to create other quilt blocks out of. But because it's so simple to use and it's so versatile, almost any quilt that you see will use half square triangles. Most of the blocks that you're used to seeing, bear paws, churn dashes, shoe flies, will all use half square triangle units. They're really simple to make, and we're going to start showing you how to do that right now.
Let's look at exactly what we're going to do for today's project. So I'm going to pull these quilts up here so that we can see them. Today we're going to focus on making a pinwheel quilt. And if you can see from our half square triangle unit, it's made of 4 different units. So here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And all we've done is just rotated them around a bigger square to make our pinwheel block. We have 2 examples. This is our very modern quilt and the fabrics that we will be using in today's lesson. But this is also a quilt that my daughter and I made that actually lays on the bottom of her bed. She is 10, and she and I made a pinwheel quilt for her room. This is a very more traditional quilt. You can see the different sizes in fabrics, and we've done some polka dots for the sashing. We've gone with very traditional colors, her favorite colors in the quilt as well.
And it's more of a traditional quilt as well. You can see the difference between the plain and the solids that is in a more modern quilt. And then in a more traditional quilt, it's usually a mix of different kinds of prints. So there's flowers and polka dots and other prints that all have been mixed together to create this quilt top.
And speaking of the quilt top, you're kind of going to see our finished product. So we can talk about that. It has a quilt top, and then if you'll see in here that the quilt has actually been quilted, so it's holding together our quilt top and our batting that's in the middle, and then on the back is our backing fabric. So this is what we're going to be making is a full quilt by the end of today's lessons. And you can see this one has been washed and loved a million times. It's all crinkled, and she loves it, and I love it too. It's one of my favorite projects that she and I have done together.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get started with,
move these
we're
a
gonna
little
move
bit
our
out of the
big
way.
quilt out of the way. Just roll this guy up, move him on over here.
The first thing that we're going to need to do is to do our fabric cutting. And we want to talk a little bit about fabric cutting because we are doing such a beginning introductory course. We want to talk a little bit about cutting fabric and some tips and tricks for doing that correctly
And accurately.
or sometimes incorrectly. Sometimes we're known as cowboy sewists, but we try our best to teach good things.
Yes, even if we don't practice them ourselves.
Okay, so let's start with this piece of white fabric. For this modern quilt that we're going to be focusing on, we're using white as our background, and then a lot of organic solids is what is going to be the colored fabrics. And we have a pile of those over there, but we don't have any of our white, so we're going to show you how we cut fabric. The first thing that I'm going to do is use our cutting mat, and I'm going to line up the fold of our fabric along one of the horizontal lines on our cutting mat. Just do it slowly and carefully so that you have that square on one of the lines. Then I'm going to take my cutting ruler, pick this up, and what I'm going to do is take off a little snippet of this side of the fabric so that I can square it up and know that I'm starting with a straight line at the bottom and a straight line on the side. So then when I'm measuring, I can move it over and have accurate cuts.
There's your rotary cutter.
Okay, I'm just going to line my quilting ruler up. I don't quite have 5 down there, so I'm gonna move over to 5.5. But if you'll see right down here, I can do this 2 ways. So I can also put one of the horizontal lines onto my fabric so I know that that's lined up. And then I can move, I'm looking at this line right here and I'm just lining it up with this 6. So this is on the 5.5. I'm going to do that same thing that I've done down here, just hold it, move it over so I have it accurate on this side. I'm going to hold down my cutting ruler and just take that little snippet off. So now I know that I have a straight line on the bottom and I have a straight line on one side. For this project, our quilt blocks are going to end up being 12 inches, but we are going to need 6 7/8 inches for our blocks to turn them into our half square triangle units. So I need to measure over, actually I've done myself a disservice. I'm gonna move it over a little bit because I want to be on a whole number. Just because sometimes with quilting, my math brain doesn't work so well. So again, I've got it lined up, straight horizontally, straight vertically. I'm going to count over 6 7/8, which is going to put me on this little line right here that I can square up on the bottom, square up again on the top.
And you're gonna notice as Elizabeth cuts next that she's holding her rotary cutter. It's going exactly along the edge of her ruler and she's cutting away from her. I don't know how many classes we've taught where people put the ruler down and they're cutting towards themselves. Don't do that.
Be safe cutting.
So cut it away from you. Just hold it firmly against your ruler and cut away from you as you're cutting.
Sometimes people will have problems again with this sliding. Make sure that you have a firm grasp. You're pushing down, putting some pressure on this ruler as you're cutting because you don't want this to slide over and then you're cutting not square. It takes a few tries to practice, but you will get there. Okay, so I've got this cut. I need to make it a square now. So I'm just going to move it down here to make it a little bit easier for us. Again, I'm lining the fabric up on a horizontal line. I'm going to move it over a little bit. I don't want these selvages to be in any of my units or in my quilt blocks. So make sure that you're always looking for those and cutting those off. I'm just going to trim off that little selvage part right there. Then again, I'm going to measure over 6 7/8. Line it up on this side. Line it up on the top.
Perfect. Now, you'll notice too that we've kept the fabric folded in half. So now that she's cut this one square out, she's actually going to have two, which is a time-saving trick that we love and use all the time.
And I would keep going on this. So in quilting, we kind of like to do fast tricks. So when you're cutting all of your fabric, I like to cut all of my long rows that we cut first. And then after I have all of those cut, then I can line up a row here, I can line up another row up here, I can line up a third row, and then I can cut a lot of squares all at the same time.
Yeah, so
I would just cut
like
the next row right here, and then keep going until I run out of fabric. It's a good time saver. The other trick that we like to use is cutting all of your fabric at once.
Yes.
So it's not very fast if you cut, make one quilt unit, come back, cut, make another quilt unit. Do all of your cutting up front so you've got that done and out of the way.
In fact, that's exactly what we've done today. So we've already cut all of our colored pieces, and if we were making this entire quilt right now, we would cut all of our white pieces. So we've got everything cut, so when we sit down to sew, we have everything we need, and we can just spend time at the machine without having to go back and forth between cutting and sewing.
All right, so we're ready to make our half square triangle unit. I'm just going to move our cutting materials out of the way. And for each half square triangle unit, you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric. We're showing you a very traditional way to make half square triangles, but don't panic if you've seen a different way or if someone else has shown you a different way. There's lots of ways to get to the same end.
There are, and most quilters, as we've gone to different quilting guilds and have been in classes with different quilters, are really married to whatever method they learned. So whatever method that they learned from their grandma or their mother, that's the method that is the right method and the only method. We don't feel that way. There's lots of methods that work, and as long as it gets you to the right end, it works for us. So today we're just going to show you our favorite way to make half square triangle units.
So let's get started on that part. We are going to take one solid fabric, and we have that really soft organic fabric that feels really great for our solid piece, and then that white piece that we just cut. All I'm going to do is lay my white square on top of my blue square, and I'm going to make the corners match as best as I can.
And I'm going to interrupt you really quick.
Please do.
We have solid fabrics, and we already have them set up, so they're going to be right sides together. With solid fabric, sometimes it's hard to tell which is the right side and the wrong side. However, if you are making this quilt using a patterned print, you're going to be making sure that you put the right sides together. And you'll be able to tell that really easily with a pattern print, which is the right side. And the right side is the top
the printed side.
The printed side of the fabric.
Good catch, because we are using solids today, so you don't want one half of your fabric to be the good side and one half of your half square triangle to be the wrong side.
Which I've done before.
We've all done it.
Many times.
We've all done it. All right, so we've got this one ready to go. Liz, will you put together that second one?
Mm-hmm.
And then all I'm going to do is take those fabric marking pens that we were talking about in the very beginning when we talked about our materials, and I'm going to line up my quilting ruler so that it is going from diagonal to diagonal, hence where our triangles come from. And I'm just going to make a line down the middle. If you don't have a fabric marking pen and you want to work on this project right now, use a pencil, because honestly, this line is going to be cut off, so you're never going to even see it.
I always use a pencil.
So there's one that's done.
Okay, here's
Let's
your next
do our
guy.
second one. And a quick tip that I love to do, so if I'm marking a ton of these at a time, I like to just start right here and line up the first one on a vertical line on my quilting mat. I line up the second one, and then all I have to do is take my ruler, put it on that line that goes in between both of them, and then I can just keep going. So that helps to make your quilting a little faster too.
Saves time, for sure.
All right, let me make sure I just got that top one marked. Okay, I've got them both ready to go.
Okay, now that we have them marked, all we're going to do is we're going to sew. We're going to follow this line, and we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam on each side of this line. So I'm going to stick my fabric right in here, lower it with our nifty presser foot lower, and I'm just going to sew. So I'm going just inside the edge of my foot along the line, and that is what's going to create this 1/4 inch seam.
And again, Liz talked about earlier that we're using red thread today. At home, you're probably not going to choose red thread, but we want you to be able to see where those stitching lines are. Quilting traditionally uses 1/4 inch seam allowances. It's been found that it's a very stable seam, but it also doesn't waste a lot of fabric. If you're coming from the garment sewing world, which we were quite a few years ago, both of us started sewing garments, you'll notice that the seam allowances are a lot different. You're either using a 1/2 inch or a 5/8 inch seam allowances. And in quilting, it's reduced. You don't want the bulk on the back of your quilt blocks, so 1/4 inch is kind of this quilting standard for that.
All right, now you'll notice I sewed down the first guy. If we do this at home, we like to do what's called chain piecing. Or chain quilting. We like to take and keep a continuous chain going of our blocks or our units going right through our machine. That way we're not stopping and clipping every time. So I'm just going to keep going, and you're going to see this guy's going to keep coming out the back side of my sewing machine. I'm going to sew this guy down. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there are specific quilting 1/4 inch feet that you can purchase for your machine. Our Baby Lock Symphony today has a number 2 stitch on it, which is meant for piecing quilting. So we're just using that stitch, but you probably should measure on your machine or look in your manual to make sure you know where that 1/4 inch line goes.
Okay, sewing down this side.
So Liz was talking about chain piecing before. Honestly, when both of us are at home sewing, we will have like a chain going of 100 of these going. So I will sew all of them the same direction and then take it off the machine, turn around and flip it all the way around. And then you're gonna just chain, keep going for your second side.
Yep. All right, here we go. Sewing up this guy. We'll be done here in just 1 minute. Okay, and we're done. We're gonna cut him off. Now normally, like you said, we'd have a giant chain of these units going, but today we only have 2, so I will cut those apart.
And sometimes when my 10-year-old wants to help quilt, she is the chain piecer cutter.
It's a perfect job.
So she goes in the chain and can clip all of those, and she feels like she is right there working with me. Okay, now that we have these done, what we need to do is cut them apart. So there's a couple different ways to do that. You can take all of these, sit in front of your favorite show at night, take some scissors and cut them all, or you can use a rotary cutter. So Liz, do you want to cut that one with the scissors?
I'll just cut it with the scissors, which is what I do quite often, is exactly what Elizabeth said, is watch my Murder, She Wrote and cut apart my squares.
And then sometimes I use my cutting mat as well. So I line them up as if I were marking them, so I can cut a couple at a time, and then I'm just going to follow that black line of that fabric marker and cut them all apart.
All right, and then when you open them up, you'll see that now you have 2 half square triangles by only doing the work on 1 square.
We're going to show you a really great tool that we love right here. So in quilting, after we've made an individual unit, we do what's called squaring up our units. And basically, all it does is making sure that we're taking our little units, making sure they're square, so that when we put them all together, that our quilt is square and not catterwampus.
Yes, if you don't square, which I didn't, all of a sudden your blocks don't all fit together and your lines aren't going to be straight. Even sometimes when you square, your lines don't always come out perfectly straight, but if you don't square your blocks, there's not a chance it's going to work out.
So traditionally, you would now take these over and press them and then square up the blocks. But we have this trimming ruler that is specifically made for trimming half square triangles. I'm going to put this down. I might put the fabric underneath it so that you can see it a little bit better.
Maybe use the white side. Let's use the white
let's
side,
do
then we
that.
can see the lines.
That's perfect. So if you'll notice, it has lines. So on this side, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then if I turn it over and rotate it, it has 1.5, 2.5. It has the halves. So I could make a half square triangle unit anywhere from 1.5 inches up to 6.5 inches and trim it using this ruler. And it is genius. I'll show you in just a second. So we are ending up with 6-inch finished half square triangle units. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my number 6 along this red stitching line that Liz just stitched for us. I'm going to make my point, end in the point, and then all I'm going to do is trim 2 sides. It's actually trimming all 4 sides. We're kind of doing it in the fast method.
Right, because it's folded over in half, so we're going to get all 4 sides at once.
So all I've done, and you'll just see I'm only taking off a little scant piece on both sides, and you'd be surprised at how big of a difference that makes, is just making sure that you start with square pieces so that your quilt will end up more square. Not that it has to be perfect, because none of our quilts are ever going to be perfect, but it gives you a better chance.
Yes, yes, it increases your chances for sure. Now is the time that we would open these after we cut them and press them.
So let's pull this over. We're just going to go right over here to our pressing mat. Pull this in right here. And Liz and I were talking about this last night, about how we press quilt blocks. And luckily, we both do it the same.
Yes, we don't always do everything the same. Actually, most often we do everything opposite.
Completely opposite. But today, we both iron and press the same. So I like to, and actually, sometimes I do this. We'll teach you the right way. So the first thing that you should do, sometimes I don't,
yes,
but the first thing you should do is just give this a good press to set the seam. So you just press that to make sure that that seam is set. And then our tip in quilting is we're always going to press towards the darker fabrics.
Yep.
So because I have white on one side and a solid, I'm going to press my seam allowance so that it's not showing on the white side, it's going to show underneath the darker side. So all I do is I hold my fabric and I'm kind of pulling it open. I'm not trying to move the fabric, but I'm just making sure that that seam is open, and then I'm pressing it. And pressing and ironing are 2 different things in quilting.
they are. They're 2 very different things. In fact, we had taken some courses a while back, and our instructor was fabulous. She was 88 years old, and she was amazing. But she gave Elizabeth and I a 4-hour lesson on the difference between pressing and ironing that we will never forget. Ironing is when you move the iron like this across the fabric, and it's going to move the fabric. Pressing is where you're actually applying pressure to the iron, and it is changing the way that the fabric is shaped, setting those creases.
And most of the time we're dealing with cotton, so if you are ironing and pulling, cotton can shrink, cotton can move. It's a very malleable fabric, I guess is the word.
It's finicky, so.
All right, so we've pressed it on that back side, and then we turn it over. We both press with the back first, and then on the front, I just give this a little tug to make sure that the seams are open. And then I'm just going to hold the iron on and press it down until that seam is open. When I first started quilting, this was really hard for me. I would go back and sew, and I would find that my seams were kind of not opened all the way.
I'll show you a quick example really
Perfect.
quickly. Like this, where they would get caught instead of being pulled open all the way. So, and that is an easy thing to do, is to have them get caught just like that.
And especially if you're ironing a ton, so if you're chain piecing, you're going to stand at the iron. Sometimes you're a little too into Murder, She Wrote and then not get your seams all the way open. But that can make the difference in your quilt looking a little more professional, is making sure those seams really get pressed open. All right, so I'm going to hand this one to you.
Yes, well, we're going to show you, not everyone has access to this kind of a ruler that we just used. So we're going to show you how to square up your block if you don't have this ruler.
Let me press one more. Making sure that seam is open for you. And while you're getting ready to do that, I will show you that on these little quilts, if you use this trimming ruler, you are going to still have these little triangles that kind of poke off the sides. I call them dog ears. What do you call them? They're little dog ears on a quilt.
I don't call them anything.
Liz doesn't have a word for them. I just like to trim those off too. They just kind of take up less bulk on the back of your quilt. Sometimes I don't, but when I'm being a really good quilter, I like to trim these off. So I'll teach you the way you should do it. Just trim that off right there.
Okay, this guy, we need to make our block 6 inches by 6 inches squared. So all I'm doing is I found a 6-inch square here on my cutting mat, and I'm going to go from diagonal point in the one corner of the 6-inch square down to the diagonal point in the other, and just make sure that the points are in there. And you can see just by looking at it that it's not exactly square, which is why we're squaring it up. So all I'll do is I'll just take my ruler, and I love the rulers and the mats that have these scored lines on them, so I can just measure right on the surface I'm working on. And
sorry, I think I didn't close it last time, so I think you just closed it.
I just closed it? Okay.
From when I had left it
I
open.
see.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. We're using your rotary cutter.
We have different rotary cutters.
We have
that
different
love.
rotary cutters. And this one's just going to be a tiny bit. Wow, that was a super tiny bit. And then I'm going to, because I like to cut away from me, I don't like to cut so much this way. And I think you do it the other way, but I will turn my block now.
I turn it too.
Do you
it's
really?
easier. I do. I think it's
Awesome.
easier.
We have two things in common. All right, and then I'm just going to chop up these other sides really quickly. So my block is going to be nice and square. Like I said in the beginning, I did not do this, and I was always a little bit frustrated with the results of my quilt. I would have spent all this time creating these blocks, and when I got to the end, it just didn't look quite right. But now that I actually take the time to square all the blocks, my quilts, I'm much happier with the results. When you're doing this and you're squaring up blocks 2 or 3 times as you go through the process, you'll see that we will. Sometimes you're like, this isn't worth it, I just want to be done. I promise, it's always worth it.
It is.
Okay, we're square.
All right, so we've got those.
Now should we do the other two
Yeah,
really
let's do
quickly?
these really
let's
fast.
use them with our quick cut tool.
To make our pinwheel quilt block, we're going to need 4 of these. So I will just trim up these other 2 really quickly. And you can see now from trimming both ways that this one is a little bit of a time saver, which we love. Will you trim that last one, and I will start
Yes, for
pressing
sure.
this guy?
Yep, will do. And once we get these done, we'll show you how to lay out the pinwheel block, but I also want to show you really quickly how versatile these half square triangle units are to make other blocks, how they can even make patterns in your quilting. So we'll show you that really quickly once we've got these all ironed and laid out. Okay, he's good to go.
All right, one more.
Okay, I'm gonna lay these out.
Perfect.
Not in a pinwheel quickly. So there's quite a few different layouts that you can do. Recently, I just put together a quilt where I had all of them face in towards the middle to create this diamond pattern, which is simple, it's fun, it's easy. There's lots of different ways you can put them in a line, like so, and like so, to create graphic patterns also through your quilt. You can have tons of fun playing with this, and I always spend way too much time laying out my half square triangles instead of actually just putting together the blocks I should be doing.
And there's so many different, you can do a chevron pattern, you can do lots and lots of things. The quilt behind us, if you'll notice that one, is just 4, or is just, on this one would be 4. So she's kind of showing you a chevron pattern.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep, so, and then you would just continue going up and down. Or the quilt that's behind us is just basic triangles. And you can just put them all in a row. And with lots of different fabrics, it looks fantastic. And it really is as easy as a half square triangle unit.
It is, it's super easy. Once you know how to build a half square triangle, you can make pretty much any quilt block that you'd like. All right, let's build a pinwheel.
Let's build the pinwheel. So let's pull this quilt back over so we can show you exactly what the pinwheel looks like. And then we'll have Liz build one down here. So basically the pinwheel is just rotated so that you have a corner of one of your half square triangle blocks all coming to the center. And every time I do this, I always think I'm going to remember how to make a pinwheel, but I really have to physically lay out all of the pinwheels because sometimes your mind will start playing tricks on you.
It's true. The first time I did this, I was so mad. I was following the instructions and I laid my pieces out and I was like, I followed the instructions and this is what I've got. You just need to play with them every time.
And I really do. I get a big surface out, I lay out all of the pinwheel blocks so that I can sew them together and that they all work. Sorry, I did not trim off those little dog ears.
Chopping those guys off
doing
really
that
quick.
right. All right, we'll move this back out of the way. We'll pull it back out. Show you
and you just moved
done.
it, so now I was confused. Okay, there we go.
All right, so if you'll notice, our pinwheels are just opposite, but all of our points are heading towards the middle, and then we have blue, white, all the way around. So just remember that. You will get mixed up, especially in the middle when you're like, wait, how does this go?
Okay.
Okay, we're ready to sew, I think.
Yes, now that we have them laid out, we're going to sew them together. The way that we put our quilt blocks together is we're going to sew the first one to the second one in the top row, and then the second to, or the third to the fourth in the next row down. And I'm just going to chain piece those. So what I'm going to do is I'll fold this over. I will put right sides together. I'm going to line this up. Elizabeth likes to pin these guys. She's a big pinner.
I'm a big quilt pinner. Liz is not a pinner.
I am not a pinner, and so I'm not going to pin. So I'm just going to put these right sides together. I'm just going to make sure that my seams just match up really nice.
Well, and you can see what Liz is doing. You can kind of see in there where she's doing what's called nesting the seams. And you can, because we've pressed towards the darker side on both, when you're pushing them together, it's a little bit hard to explain, but when you're doing it yourself, you will see it. You can see where those seams are going to fit and bump up right next to each other.
Like a little puzzle. They just nestle into each other really well. Okay, now
I could see you doing that. I just wanted to point out what you were doing.
All right, now though, I messed it up.
Oh, darn it.
I messed up our world. I'm going to do the bottom two while you figure out the top two worlds.
I got to do all 4 at the same time, though,
Okay.
so we make sure we're right. There we go.
Kapow. Okay, then we'll start with the top
All right,
again.
here's your seam right there to sew.
All right, perfect.
I'll get this one ready and have my finger on which seam you're sewing. See how
Thank
easy
you,
it can
thank
be
you.
to mix yourself up?
Okay. Same thing, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew these guys together. So I'm just going to sew right down the edge, again using the edge of my presser foot as a guide. We'll sew right down. It's easy to get the seam pushed back, so I just always hold it down with my finger till the last second, just so I can make sure that the seam is going the way that I pressed it. All right, we're good this way?
Perfect.
Just double checking.
I held it in place to make sure.
I have done this more than once where then I open it up and it's bad words all over the place.
That's why
All
the
right.
seam ripper always comes in handy.
Okay, I'll finish up going down the side of this guy.
And again, you're just going to be sewing a lot of these in a long, long line to make the process a little bit faster.
Okay, so let's open them up.
And cross our fingers.
Yes.
We did it.
We did it correctly.
All right, now that we have these two together, we need to go back and press them. Again, don't skip the pressing steps. It makes a big difference. So we'll just set that seam, and then I'm just going to move this quilt over a little tiny bit more.
Perfect.
And again, my rule of thumb is just always press towards the darker fabric.
Now the reason that we press towards the darker fabric, that's our preference, is lighter fabric sometimes it is easier to see through. So if we press towards the lighter side, you'll be able to see all of your seam lines coming through. Sometimes you still can, depending on the fabric, on your darker side, but it's less likely to have that happen. So that's why our rule of thumb is press towards the dark side.
Okay, there's our row 1 of our quilt block. And actually, because we have opposite in this pinwheel quilt, it's actually going to help us nest all of those seams in there because we've pressed opposite ways on both rows. All right.
Okay, perfect. Now the same thing, I'm going to put right sides together. I'm going to nestle these little seams in here together. Join them up, make them happy. Again, Elizabeth would be pinning the heck out of these.
Only in the middle.
She says only the middle. I've watched her sew. All right, and then I'm just going to sew these down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Just move it over here. All right. And we're going. I'm just going to hold mine because since I don't use pins, I just need to hang on to my cross section because I want my points to match up as closely as they can right there in the middle. Push that down. And I'm going to rehold that right here. Now it's going to be a little ka-chunky going over all those layers of fabric right there in the middle, so I usually slow down. Even though when I normally sew I'm going 100 miles an hour, right there over that bump I do slow down a little bit.
You do sew 100 miles an hour.
I do sew 100. It's because I only have 5 minutes to sew in between picking up kids and dropping them off places.
It's true.
All right, we are done sewing down that line. Now's the moment of truth. We get to open this guy up. Beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Done.
All we're going to do is press this one last time. Set that seam. Look how good those points look, Liz.
Even without the pins.
Even without the pins, I'm very impressed.
Now sometimes, and I am a rule skipper, but sometimes I will take and starch as I'm ironing, which is a rule I used to skip. It's not really a rule, but it's a step I used to skip because using just that little bit of starch when you're pressing these out the last time makes your blocks look awesome.
Well, and I was going to say that if you look at a quilt, I mean, Liz really did an awesome job on these points. But if you look at my quilt that we have over here, not every point is going to be perfect. And a lot of times we always say that quilting is not about perfection. Whoever you make the quilt for or who you give the quilt to is going to love it, and they're not going to be looking at your points.
They're not. And even if you notice them, once they've been quilted, that also is going to, the quilting process is going to change and shift your blocks a little bit, and you're not going to notice your own mistakes as much. Promise.
So there is our full pinwheel block that's there. And coming up next, we're going to talk about laying out our full quilt top.